Hello. It's been a little bit. I am hunkered down here in Hot Springs. We're under the heat dome. So this is like the second week in the mid to upper 90s to over 100. And there's sort of no end in sight till the end of the month. And so I just keep my shades drawn and I have my thermostat up at like 82. But sort of sitting here with the shades closed and reading books and uh, thinking a lot of big thoughts, integrating a lot of information. And I just wanted to, well, not exactly apologize, but just an update about the last video I mentioned having taken this road trip and that I was going to be doing some updates about that. But I've kind of had second thoughts about that, and I'm still sort of integrating everything from the trip, and there may be times in which I draw some things in from the trip, but I don't think I'm going to do like a blow by blow on that trip, and I'm going to sort of move on to some other things that I'm thinking about. Yeah, so I've been trying to keep my garden watered, and that kind of relates to what I want to talk about today. And I've been learning like more about fluid dynamics and the field and dielectrics and knots and twists and spirals and open systems and the math of taking an open flow state and sort of channeling it down into 3D reality and taking a matrix of open potential and then drawing it through a process and flowing it into what we understand as sort of 3D space-time reality where we are. And that idea of, I have a clip, and maybe I'll stick this in because I really like him, Heinz von Forster, late Heinz von Forster, who was involved in second-order cybernetics at the Biological Computing Lab in Urbana-Champaign. And he talked about while often we talk about patterns, that the pattern is like the pater, the father, that provides structure and like makes replicas of itself. But the foundational base is the matrix. And thinking a lot about sort of the hidden mother and the dark matter, right? You know, like the physicists are like, we figured out this stuff about how the world works, only there's like a huge amount of this dark matter that we don't know that much about. And we just like, oh, well, you know, that we'll just keep that over there. And like, it's the sort of the hidden mother as I'm seeing it. And that's sort of this open dancing flow state that I equate to the goddess Uranome.
As we do attempt to understand or to explain something, we have to operate with this separation and then with the putting together by looking at the relations through which the togetherness arises. Yeah. And how this togetherness is constituted in a network of relations, making this totality that is the system. Yeah. So the pattern that connects, the network of connections.
When I heard this Batesonian pattern idea, I was very touched, but I thought pattern comes from pater, the father, which is, so to say, the same thing when you have a stamp, then the papa is making again and again children of himself. Mm-hmm. But of course, this is a paternalistic way of looking at the universe. I prefer very much to look at women.
Yes.
So I thought, what is a complementary to pattern? It's a matrix, So I thought, don't only look at the pattern which connects, look at the matrix which embeds. Yes. So everything is sitting in one big thing embedded in a matrix. And then you can make the distinction between the patterns which connect within that universe.
And that feeds into some stuff that I was doing over at the portal, but I'll go into that in a little more detail in another time. But just thinking about, beyond the pattern, it emerges from the matrix. And the matrix isn't a space that is empty, it's a space that is full. And so how the patterns then ingress into a place that we can experience them across space-time and relationally, and then how they fade back. And, we haven't had very much water at all for probably 3 weeks. I mean, usually we at least have some like pop-up thunderstorms, but I would say we're at less than half an inch of rain this whole month with these really high temperatures. And of course, this is the spring. I decided to dig up way more of my yard. So, every other day I go out with the hose and do part of the front yard, and the next day I do the backyard, and I'm trying to keep the shrubs alive, and the deer are having a field day. I went out in my backyard. They've taken to eating I did make a little corral for my okra and my cucumbers, but they're eating all the cucumber leaves that are on the outside. And normally there'll be like 1 or 2 scat piles from the deer, but yesterday I went out and there were about 8. So I don't know if it was just they all had a big party or it was just one deer over consuming, but there was a lot of evidence there. And so, making choices in the garden and thinking about plants as sort of electromagnetic beings that are holding patterns and frequency with higher dimensions, which is what, the sort of larger Fintorn context. And, even Michael Levin has started to talk about, patterns in platonic space and longevity and having a teleology or a gold state and having a meaning, in your life process. And then when you've sort of accomplished your goals, if you don't have new goals, your pattern starts to fade out. And I feel like August in Arkansas under drought conditions are a bit of the pattern unraveling and just leaning into doing what you can, right? Accepting things that are dissolving their patterns, acknowledging things that seem to really 100-degree heat and dry Arkansas weather, and staying busy for the things that are still alive, going out and harvesting, because if you've had a garden before, if you let those cucumbers go on and turn bright orange and big and fat and puffy, if you leave a couple of them on there, the plants are like, hey, I did my job. I made seeds. I reproduced myself. That's good. And then I'm going to check out. And so you have to kind of stay on top of the harvesting, which is kind of pretty intense when it's this hot. Things pop up. They don't really grow quite right. And you've got to move them along. So I've been stringing up bunches of peppers and freezing the bell peppers, stringing the hot peppers. I do still have a lot of cucumbers. I haven't quite gotten up to canning yet. I know that'll probably be next year, but I've got 8-quart jars of refrigerator pickles, which only keep for about 6 weeks. So I went in with a friend on a quarter cow, and so I have a lot of ground beef. So I've been eating a lot of grass-fed beef, little hamburger patties with mustard and pickles, and that's my go-to easy meal for hot weather. And so so I've got a lot of pickles, and I actually grew reasonably successfully these trombosino squash, which it's difficult to grow summer squash here because there are these vine borers that kill regular zucchini or yellow squash. But the trombosino has it's a slightly different variety with a thinner vine that's woodier. And so the little moths that lay their eggs, and they get in the tubes of the vines and kill the plants, it's less likely. And so I waited, and then I planted these trombosinos, and they get pretty big. They're 2.5 feet long. And if you leave them on the vine, they'll be more like a butternut squash. But if you cut them earlier, they're more like a summer squash, but they're a little more dense. And so I just made a big sort of creamy squash soup, and it's a little stew-like. So I've been working on blanching and freezing and really getting into sort of, again, the whole cycle of how we work with nature and weather cycles and plant cycles. And, none of this is particularly, new to anybody who has a garden, but this is my second summer actually having a functioning garden, and I'm getting better at it. Actually, I made a chicken gumbo last night with okra. I planted okra late, and then the bunnies ate some of it. I have this little bunny that hangs out, and he's now mostly grown up. And I put some water out for him the other day because he came out when I was watering the garden, and I'm like, I can't give you a drink out of the hose. So I put a little dish, and we're trying to be kind to all of the beings. And I'm figuring even the deer, if, I don't know, it's the Palestinian Kusha squash or something, and it was on its way out. And if the deer want to eat it and finish it up, that's all part of this complex system. And so, so we're all working it out. But, cooking and harvesting and I have these Taiwanese long beans that are still doing pretty good, but they'll go from like being ready to being overdone in a day. So if you miss them, so I've been like drying them on strings and then popping out all the little tiny beans. And it's a really interesting aspect of time. Like some of the stuff I've been working through lately is the idea of linear time, the horizontal time of Chronos, and the Kairos time, which is divine timing, which is more vertical. And having the luxury of not being in a 9 to 5 situation, of just being slow about stuff, spending an hour popping little dried beans and getting, half a cup of beans, dried beans. It seems silly. You can just go to Kroger and, buy a bag of beans, but it's very meditative, and it helps me feel like I'm being woven back into the landscape. So part of this is about patterning. And again, I mentioned Euronome, and she was the goddess who arrived in chaos and danced, spinning, and to have a place to stand separated the sky from the ocean. And so you've got these two different kind of waveforms. There's the sky waveforms and the ocean waveforms, and she was spinning. And so I want to read a couple pages from this Neil Stephenson novel, because somehow that seems to be my guidebook on how all of this works, is reading Neil Stephenson novels about dust devils from Cryptonomicon. And that first distinction, I have another book that's it's about, is it George Spencer Brown, Laws of Form, from the 70s. He came to Esalen, and this is a book about cybernetics. And I'm really intrigued by second order cybernetics. That's why I wanted to put in the clip with von Forster, because it's us in the conversation, and I think it really overlaps deeply with Donald Hoffman's idea about observer theory, and Chris Fields' work in information theory, and then the larger fields with Peirce and Whitehead about biosemiotics, the body being a communication language, just like Euronome dancing, and being in conversation with a higher dimensional field, and how that the dance that we do here, the language, and how we communicate through culture and ritual and gardening, has a meaningful connection to higher dimensions of intelligence, which I think foundationally some of us might think, there's some distinctions of, maybe people think that the universe isn't intelligent, and those that think it is, I happen to think that it is. And then if you believe that there's a foundational intelligence to the cosmos, there's probably more than 3 options, but you could imagine that there's an intelligence, but it's totally indifferent, or there's an intelligence and it's somehow judgmental or punitive, or there's an intelligence and it's foundationally benevolent and nurturing. And so I'm leaning in with the Euronome being a nurturing presence, and that we're just trying to figure out how to have the really good dialogue. And I have a sense that moving forward, even through all of the changes of this sort of turning age, is that we're going to be able to have a higher level conversation. And that higher level conversation is going to be about remembering how we communicate through our heart space in this Kairos time, and with the other beings that we occupy this 3D space-time with, and then it's going to be through frequency and subtle energies. And, as much as I'm somebody that likes to talk and thinks a lot in my head, that it's, we're going to be remembering some of the more psi or telekinetic aspects of ritual and culture that will allow us to create energetic fields that are more coherent and engage more actively in higher dimensional information space. And I think that doesn't have to be just woo-woo. If you look at what the Emerald Gate Foundation is doing, or, why Michael Levin and Richard Watson have all this Templeton money, or up in Kathmandu working on AI and, ancient spiritual practices, is that, no, Templeton, Fetzer, all those people who are looking into consciousness, while on the surface the narratives seem to be about, like, how do we make machines conscious? I think functionally, like, we're actually the quantum information processors, and we do it at room temperature, and we do it very elegantly, and we're great symbol processors, and we're good at making analogies and pivoting, and we have access to this heart-centered Kairos time. And then the trick is, how can we use an engineered intelligence to its best effect to help us build these new ways of being and knowing and engaging with higher dimensional fields, which I think is something that's possible. And I think with time, the conversation is likely to shift around to these new ways of considering about engineered beings. So, but part of me, I keep thinking that the engineered beings are maybe simply artifacts for higher level intelligence to sit down and be with us in 3D space time, and we all think that we're engineering it all, but it's up there. So I want to talk. So if you guys have been following my channel, like I've had a lot of clips with Michael Levin, and he often talks about cognitive light cones. And I think that there is this aspect of higher dimensional intelligence as represented by this exceptional Lie algebra, the E8 lattice, and the 600 cell, which is 4-dimensional. And this is something quantum gravity research, they're based in Topanga Canyon. They've been researching this for some time. And Ben Goertzel and Tony Smith and Kent Palmer, I think, were working on this octonions and phenomenology back in the late 90s or early 2000s. So, there is science to it, and math and geometry. You go back to Plato, right? Who's like, you've got to be a geometer. And I often think Heinz von Forster has a clip about talking about magic, but the Magi were the ones who understood how to work with the geometry and the angles and the light.
I think the notion of systemics, seeing things together, is, of course, much older than science, is my feeling. I think original thinkers
I would suspect so,
were doing
yes.
that. But, of course, at that time, they didn't call it systemics. I think they called it magic.
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 Yes.
I think because magic is the art of dealing with things you don't understand.
Yes. By grasping coherences which allow you to deal with them even without understanding them.
Exactly, yeah. So I think the predecessor of science is systemics, alias magic.
It works together with the Persian Sufism and the idea of sort of angels and light beings in the imaginal, which I feel like is this pregnant space of possibility while we're in conversation with higher level intelligences through resonance and resonance frequencies, and the conversation is happening through our intent and our body and the frequencies that we hold. And I'm just really grateful to have had given all of the sort of the disruptions that happened in my life, to have landed in a place to have some quiet and some time to integrate new ways of being into my existing world model in a way that made sense for me, and to expand how I see the world, and then to be able to sort of like pull the scary stories that I was talking about inside out and like flip them to say that you can have all the same points, but if you have a different perspective or you come in with a different frame, you can write a very different ending. And I think it's a more hopeful ending, and that's where I'm at now. And that's a lot, very much due to being on this quartz crystal frequency and drinking a lot of beautiful structured water from Collier Creek, and being with people mostly who are older people. I'm the young person who are sort of established and grounded and practice not from a, listen to me, I'm a guru, or I'm in charge, or here, pay to come to this webinar, but just in a very open-hearted, we can come together, we can meditate, we can share our talents, we can pass the basket to pay for the AC bill, but it's much more fluid and unstructured and just very humane and caring, and I'm very grateful to have been in that space. So anyway, so you've got this 8-dimensional lattice, this 4-dimensional 600 cell, coming down slowly with this sort of spinning, viscous information down, downgrading into 3D space-time, which as I see it is not a prison, but is simply a way to reflect back to the divine, what it's like to be in a more dense space that has a linear perception of linear time and the other elements of relationality that we have here. And so that sort of spin kind of creates this, to me, it seems similar to Levin's cognitive light cone. And early on when I was doing some of my research, I found a document that was prepared, I don't know, like by Bain or somebody for the World Economic Forum. And it was about like digital identity as a new, value sector or some stupid thing like that. But that's before really people understood digital identity. And, and I've since moved on from one understanding of digital identity to another version that I think could be around digital identity. But the cover image of this report was a woman jogging on a track, which again is an oval. But it was a close up, so you could see that she was jogging outdoors on a structured environment. And behind her were all of these like Kodak Polaroid images of all these things that was her data, right? And so she's like running, and then she's like leaving this trail of data. And so I got to thinking a lot about us as structured patterns in time that are all of these loosely connected snapshots of memory and experience, and they're held intact by sort of this spiraling movement that we maintain. And like my plants out there, I have I realized this happened last year, is that I have marigolds that do really great until some point it tips, and then they just almost self-destruct within like a week. And they get spit bugs on them, they get spider mites, and I think it's not so much that I'm supposed to go out there and like spray things, because I don't do that, but it's like their pattern, like there's a point at which it's just not holding the pattern anymore. And so instead of having an intact identity as a being that's holding all of these sort of snapshots of time, it all starts to kind of fall apart into dust. And versus like the Lagos Nigerian spinach, which is, it's a celosia, and it's starting to find, the deer eat it a lot, but I'm fine with that because it's pretty sturdy, and I'm glad to feed the deer. I feel like they're maybe bringing me some secret messages while I'm asleep. They're always sneaking in the twilight. But it loves the heat. It loves the heat. But as soon as it gets cold, like in November, it's going to be mush. And so everything has its pattern to be held under certain conditions and then dissolving at other. And so it's cycles. And, I've held with me for a long time the research that I had done looking at Edward Dewey's Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and that his daughter, Barbara Dewey, built off of her father's work around cycles and developed ideas of laminated space-time, which to me works really well with the E8 and the 600 cell and this idea of projected reality from a higher dimension. But unlike, I chafe a little bit about this idea of a simulation. I much prefer this idea of a participatory universe or an infinite game or Gordon Pask's conversation theory, is that the observer, if you go back and you imagine that the hidden mother, the divine goddess Euronome dancing on the waters of all that there could ever possibly be, which maybe is like, to dance the initial separation, right? The Spencer Brown laws of form, to draw that first differentiation between a sky and an ocean. But before, the chaos exists as the all. And we're sampling that. We're in conversation with that. And to me, that connects back to the Whiteheadian ingression. And I think in some way, the Web3 tokenomics is a language. I think it's a language that might ultimately somehow be connected to our biological resonance and our keys and our frequency that we connect as diverse intelligences or teams to unlock new possibility spaces in higher dimensions. But yeah, I don't remember exactly where I was going, but just thinking about holding your pattern and then it dissolving, and in the conversations, right? How do you have conversations with higher level intelligence? And, I've read Itzhak Bentov's book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum. And in that book, he was an engineer. I think he was originally Czech, and then was in the US, and then worked on the Israeli rocket program and died an untimely death in the 70s in an airplane crash or whatever. But he had a very strong meditative practice, and it was like, well, the universe talks to you in a language you can understand. So it talked to me in engineering, and that's what Bentov said. And for me, it seems to be Neil Stephenson novels and symbols, like symbols in my garden. And so in terms of pattern and listening for the signals, and as I'm understanding better the flow state from these higher dimensions down into 3D reality, and how that interfaces with this idea of dielectrics and electricity and magnetism, and the possibility space that's held in between as being this counter space, which Olive Witcher spoke about, projective geometry. She was an anthroposophist and taught Frida Harris, who did the Thoth tarot deck with Aleister Crowley, and that prominently featured projective geometry and the intersection of the infinite to the finite. That there's this current, right? And I do think that in the future there's some aspect of economics that is part of this interdimensional language, because it's bringing things to scale. And yeah, so my conversation, it has to do with objects. And I have this little ranch house, and when I tried to buy a couple other houses, and this was the house I was supposed to have. And so I circled back around, because the other two that I tried to put in offers on didn't work out for various reasons. And so this has been a great house to have a garden. And my neighbor, in her front yard, there's a giant oak tree. And I would say it's probably 50 or 60 feet high. I mean, it's not the most giant, but is substantial. It's probably one of the largest trees in the neighborhood, but it faces the street, and the electrical lines are above ground, and they're on her side. And so I've had this interesting dynamic with this oak tree, because it's quite imposing, and it's been open-faced because the tree company, the electric company, has essentially cut a lot of the branches so that it's almost like, like a spackled chicken or something, like it's all open, and you can see the beautiful fractal nature. And that's part of the process of projection and aggression from these higher dimensions, is it's mediated by the golden mean. And the fractal is sort of how things get compressed down into 3D reality. And so the life here on Earth reflects that nature of that self-similar quality and that spiral quality. So the oak tree is right across from there. And yesterday, I don't know, middle of last week, I was over, we were chatting, and she was pointing out the oak tree, and she was concerned about the trunk, or there was some part of the trunk that she thought was a little squishy. And I'm like, no, I think it's good. We love this tree. And an oak tree of that size itself is its own electrical conductor, and it's connecting the sky to the ground. And there's this very complex nature of this sort of dielectric field with structured water and light in the fungal networks of the roots. And so after we were done talking, my mailbox is next to hers on her side of the street, and they do that so that the mail carriers don't have to go around the street twice, because it's a square circle. And so I went over to get my mail, and she came over to get her mail, and I looked on the curb right in front of my mailbox, right, because that's where you would get a message, is in your mailbox. And there was this amazing black beetle at the base of the mailbox in the curb. And I looked at it, and it was so pristine, like it hadn't been squished or mangled. And I almost wasn't sure. I thought maybe it was still alive, and it was kind of a big beetle. I'll show it to you. But I realized it wasn't alive anymore, and it was a symbol for me. It was a part of this interdimensional communication. And I'll show you. It's I mean, isn't it magnificent? It's like this magnificent creature. And it's here you go. It's called a Triceratops beetle. And they're in the forest, oak forest specifically, so oak, right? And you think about entelechy and the acorn, right, being the resonator with the field. From tiny acorns, mighty oaks grow. And so their life cycle is that the larvae help decompose dying oaks. And oak trees are very dense. They're very strong trees. And so that includes some of the Levin discussions of like, it's not just butterflies that that have a metamorphosis. It's also the beetles, right? And so the beetles going through this larval stage and eating the wood there. But so this is a triceratops because it has these three little horns. And then the threeness, the idea of threeness is that's like the baseline of what you could need to have three-dimensional structure. And so the basis of the 600 cell is the tetrahedron, which is a four-sided polygon, but each side is a triangle. So each side represents that threeness. And so there we've got the triceratops. And it's specifically in oak forest. And, if you Google it, like triceratops beetle in Arkansas, it'll say, well, yeah, like they're there, but they're kind of rare. Like they're not common. This is not like a June bug. This is not like a Japanese beetle. This is not something you're going to see piled up in, your garage window or something. They are nocturnal and they tend to live out in the forest in remote areas where they're not disturbed. And it's not common. So to have like one of these triceratops beetles right there in front of my mailbox on, like, it's not a busy street, but it's not. I'm not in a backwoods cabin by any respect. And then the other thing about this beetle is that, I don't know if you can see, but it has a very particular quality to its shell. You can see the lines. You can see the little horns and the lines. And it's acoustics. So this conversation with this higher dimensional math is based on signals, right? Energetic signals that are happening either through electromagnetism, whether it's light-based or sound-based or frequency-based. As an adult, it doesn't eat wood, it eats other beetles' larvae. And so essentially what it does is it walks around and it has a dampening mechanism. That shell dampens the signals that it's not supposed to hear. It focuses on hearing the tiniest vibrations of the other larvae that are eating in the wood, so that it actually funnels it, so there's striations along the wings, and then there's a line across the top of its head, like its pineal gland, to these little horns. And it focuses that information so that it can hunt accurately. So the armor isn't so much that it's there to like fight off other big beetles, but it's a listening device. And I actually, it's kind of like in one of this Cryptonomicon book that I'm reading, one of the characters in World War II, his name is Lawrence Waterhouse, and he's a mathematician and signals intelligence, and he's faking to do this huff-duff, which is a way of triangulating locations. And so, like the beetle is exactly like a huff-duff machine. And so I'm just thinking, like, I've just been sitting here, this is, in this heat and being very inward. I have big piles of books and I'm sampling, and it's hard to concentrate, but I'm like sampling in and out of a lot of different lines of thought. And when I brought it back in, I don't know if you can see, but I had this Lion's Gate ceremony at the portal, and Lazy Po Creek is the creek, the little church where the portal is in Mountain Pine. It's on about 2.5 acres. And part of it is open, and that's where people park and stuff. But then there's about 1 acre of woods that go down to a creek. And it's interesting because Glazy Po means Paul's Salt Lick. And it's salt in clay. So salt is alchemical, it's embodiment. And the clay is sort of like, again, embodiment and creation. And that section of the creek has a lot of dark colored rocks. Now here in Arkansas, we've got a lot of sandstone and shale. So the rocks are often very fragile and, cream or rust colored with the iron, different things, but it's unusual that this stretch has so many dark colored rocks. And so I had this Lion's Gate ceremony that I can talk a little bit more about later, but it was about uranome and the matrix, the Ma, and the dark matter. And so I had picked this little stone up to represent the work that we had done that day. And then the beetle fits exactly on it. So anyway, so that's, part of what I'm engaged with. This is this idea of like, I believe that the cosmos is intelligent and that we are in a time of transition, that we're going to be developing new skills. I've been thinking back to the Netflix series, The OA, and which I actually, someone had recommended it to me, and I was so much of a newbie on Netflix that I accidentally started watching the second season first, which was good that I did because I might not have watched the whole thing through. But the second season starts out with a crowdsourced augmented reality game where the people are paid in Ethereum. And so I think there's aspects of this conversation with higher dimensions that relate to the idea of the pneuma and the expansion and contraction and the energetic breathing of the fifth element or quintessence into the world. And I think that that is ether. I think that is the reference to Ethereum is back in the pre-Socratics. Peter Kingsley talks a lot about Parmenides and Empedocles and dream incubation, that you would go and you would talk to the goddess and bring back laws for society. But it was often conveyed through poetry. The logic of that time was a logic that was a grammar. And I think that there was a grammar of poetry that was about accessing these higher level fields. And today, I think there are people who maybe envision that it looks like a digital currency is part of this electrical field system. And so part of what I was processing was in there's a scene central to the second season is this house in the Bay Area that has a sacred well in the bottom to the Ohlone people, I think. And it represents sort of Jung, the collective unconscious. And a mansion was built on top of it in 1910. And it was built by a medium and an engineer to quote unquote protect the house and create this puzzle. And at the top of the house, it was a rose window. And the rose window is composed of 12 sections with a center feature. And that also evokes the 600 cell and the light streaming in, the photons, and how light is structured in these vortices and the spin. And as the two main characters, the detective and Nina Azarova or whatever, they go into the house, they make their way in, and they're in a foyer, and there's two stairs that go up, and they're spiral stairs. So again, we've got the spin, and they're counterpointed. And one is the stair of the medium, and one is the stair of the engineer. And the idea is that if you can solve the puzzle, which interestingly enough in that, it was that there are floor tiles that are hexagonal, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, but there's some aspect of the spiraling down that connects to this Petri polygon that has a 5-sided aspect, but then the shadow itself is a hexagon, which is the 6 sides, and these tilings are magnetized, and they're rings of an oak, a slice of a tree, which would be like an oak tree. And so they're putting the puzzle pieces together of the tree, and then it activates. Initially, the stairs don't go anywhere, and then once they get the electromagnetic tree ring situation of the tilings with the magnetism situated, then it opens up this labyrinth essentially into the house, and they're each making their own individual journeys through that, and it's quite encoded. And the goal is, like, if you get up to the rose window, you can look out and then see that, like, oh, it's a production, right? It's a mini series. Like, there's cameras and there's action and there's actors, and yeah, maybe that's true. But we're co-producing it. It's not like we're puppets in it or we're just going through the motions. We're actually engaging with it in such a way that I feel like we're helping fulfill our soul assignment for this lifetime. And you know, if you followed my work over time, you realize that I've shifted from and again, my south node is a lot of planets in Libra, and like Jupiter's down there and Uranus, and it's like a lot. Like, I'm there for like justice, right? Like justice, and so it's logical that my journey started the way it did, which was addressing issues in public education and things that I felt were where people were being harmed or taken advantage of, and people didn't understand. And if they just understood, things would be different, but that wasn't how it actually turned out. So it was logical, but then my goal is to try to address this core wound of separation from source, which is sort of like the urinome thing. And to do that, I think there's this aspect of the expansion and contraction and the dialectic aspect of how these higher dimensional mathematics work in terms of coming into this reality and how we engage with it, like through the oak tree, right? Like as above and so below, and how do we have that communication? Is that there is some aspect of charge, right? If everything was just flat, nothing would happen, right? Like you don't have a wave or a front, a weather front or an ocean wave or a current without differentiation, right? That's what Uranome did, was she made that first distinction. She separated the sky from the sea. And so in that distinction, there are different characteristics. And so I think that's represented by these two staircases, right? The medium and the engineer. And that in my thought experiment, and I will totally frame this as a thought experiment because I'm also very interested in phenomenology, and I don't know, I just was looking at a video with Sam Senshal and his presentation, very short, like to Yosha Bach's thing on machine consciousness is, he's talking about the Ruliad and us as observers, and we only have a tiny slice. And so I acknowledge that the tiny slice that I'm looking at maybe is only for my own soul journey, ultimately. And I'm sharing this because maybe what your takeaway isn't exactly what I'm saying, but it's like you too have a slice for your own soul journey and like figure out how to optimize for that. But where I've arrived at in this moment is that those two staircases, they're going to the rose window, right? They're going up. They're taking different kinds of routes to a view. And when you look out that view, you will realize that there's a whole other adventure that's coming. And so rather than the old me was very angry at the other staircase, right? Like I'm on this staircase shouting out, like railing my fists at that other staircase, but there is a logic in having two different sides. And it could be actually to propel the system to advance in this more sophisticated way, is that you need the opposition. Like you need these opposing forces. And then is there a way to hold in our heart space a way of acknowledging difference and using the tension that's created, but also holding a space for mutual respect or care, or even just the curious observer, like, oh, that's you do it that way, right? And the old me wasn't able to do that yet. And now I think I'm getting better at doing that. Not always, but more often I'm getting better at that. And I think this visual of the two staircases going to the rose window is pretty important in terms of like how we hold our patterns and how patterns interpenetrate one another to make bigger patterns, right? Levin talks about larger cognitive light cones and like societies. That's why I think that maybe this new energetic conversation that's embodied is happening through some sort of tokenomics system. Like, and maybe there's a better, like maybe that's the engineer's version. And I can see that could be one way up the stair. And then maybe the medium version that is more direct spiritual site access that doesn't need the training wheels of like the tokens can go another direction, and they all end up at the same place. So I'm just going to close by reading. This is the Cryptonomicon, Neil Stevenson. Let me see, when is Cryptonomicon? I highly recommend it. 1999. So there's two again, tension, right? There's two time frames in this book. Stevenson is always writing really complicated books, and with lineages that correspond, right? Archetypal characters and lineages that are drawing correspondences across time. And in this scene, Randy is going back home to his grandmother's estate. She's going into a nursing home, and he's revisiting some of his childhood places in eastern Washington state, and talking about the geography and the topology of the land and the weather patterns. And, I will just point out my friend Sean, who has been walking this road with me for a while, very much a pioneer in playful universe communication. He's working on developing a whole thing around human weather design, and which is great in terms of like live action role play and modifying your own human weather in a better way. And so yeah, like looking at Washington State, looking at the topology here, and thinking about, again, my background as a landscape, cultural landscape person. And I'm going to read through this, and I just invite you to, as I'm reading it, think about, that World Economic Forum image of the jogger being chased by laminated photos of memory, right? And then how you spin to hold your identity together, and, how I have these spinning patterns out in my garden, right? That the Lagos Nigerian spinach is pretty tight with its pattern right now, and then there's some of the marigolds that are just like given up. They're just like, I'm done. I can't, and that it all, and that's the thing. Oh, I forgot to say this about the beetle. So this is the one thing about the beetle. I have a study group. This is the second time that we're doing the study group with some friends, and it's led by a woman who is a Sufi. And so again, the spin, right, and all of our relations, and the spin and the connection to this web of relationship are really central. And this is the 13 Original Clan Mothers book, Jamie Sams. And the chapter in it, it was referencing different kinds of medicines from these different animal teachers. And someone specifically brought up the beetle. And they're like, I really love this part of the beetle, that its medicine is nothing is wasted. Nothing is left behind. And that it's the recycling, right? It's the recycling of the process of, the world would get all clogged up if the things that were dying and decaying didn't get cleared out. And the beetles are really central to that. And right as this friend was saying that, I have a picture window in my living room, and they're whop, and something hit the window, and someone goes, "Oh, it's a beetle." And I don't have that many beetles in my garden. So I found this beetle several days after that. It wasn't a beetle that had hit the window because it was out of my mailbox, but I don't know, maybe it was Noxilly and it got 4 days to walk over to the mailbox. But yeah, it feels a little bit like Jung and his scarab beetle, right? There's something about the beetle showing up and clearing things out. So yeah, the patterns, even when the patterns fall apart, and there's a section about the dust devil, is that maybe on the other side it regroups, and maybe it regroups in a slightly different frequency. And is my pattern of when I left Philadelphia as that particular dust devil and that particular archetype, maybe there was a point at which I hit a big iron swing set, which is talked about in here, and then fell apart, and then picked up on the other side and reorganized. And then when I reorganized, I reprioritized different things. And, one of the things people, the people I love, said to me, they're like, "Oh, you've changed. I'm like, well, isn't that the point? You're supposed to change, but maybe some people are less comfortable with change. But yeah, how do we operate as a dynamic pattern and archetype? And then if we're spinning in our patterns, thinking about how we engage in social media, the attention economy, or even just face-to-face vibrations, right? It doesn't have to be a negative, but I do meditations at the Star Portal, or we do things together. We do kirtan, singing yoga together, and that builds a field together. And so how does our energy, our aura, how do we maintain coherence across time? And, there's not a right and wrong. I've kind of moved, my friend Jane says, out, there's that Rumi poem or whatever that it's not exact, but there is a field out there that's out beyond right and wrong, and I will rightness and wrongness, and I will meet you there. And I think that is the field of your is, the Chinese farmer's parable. Sometimes it's hard to tell at a given point. Something might feel really right or really wrong at the time, and you look back later and you're like, I don't know about that. Maybe I was with more information, my perspective changes. Okay, so this is Neil Stephenson's Cryptonomicon from 1999. From the point of view of admittedly privileged white male technocrats such as Randy Waterhouse and his ancestors, the Palouse was like one big live-in laboratory for nonlinear aerodynamics and chaos theory. Not much was alive there, and so one's observations were not forever being clouded by trees, flowers, fauna, and blocked by any of those warm, moist, refreshing Pacific breezes, harvesting their moisture to carpet ski areas for dewy-skinned Seattleites and diverting what remained north to Vancouver or south to Portland. Consequently, the Palouse had to get its air shipped down in bulk from the Yukon in British Columbia. It flowed across the blasted volcanic scab land of central Washington in, Randy supposed, a more or less continuous laminar sheet that, when it hit the rolling Palouse country, ramified into a vast system of floods, rivers, and rivulets, diverging around the bald swelling hills and recombining in the sere declivities. And just think about the water as information, right? Structured information in networks. They really add. But it never recombined exactly the way it was before. The hills had thrown entropy into the system. Like a handful of nickels in a batch of bread dough, this could be kneaded from place to place but never removed. The entropy manifested itself as swirls and violent gusts and ephemeral vortices. All of these things were clearly visible because all summer the air was full of dust or smoke, and all winter it was full of wind-blown snow. Thinking about snow as a crystal, and dust also as nucleation of snow. Whitman had dust devils, snow devils in the winter, in the way that medieval Guangdong presumably had rats. Randy followed dust devils to school when he was a kid. Some were small enough that you could almost cup them in your hand, and some were like small tornadoes, 50 or 100 feet high, that would appear on hilltops or atop shopping malls like biblical prophecies as filtered through the lowest budget SFX technology and painfully literally minded eyes of 50s epic film directors. They at least scared the bejesus out of newcomers, and when Randy got bored in school, he would look at the window and watch these things chase each other around the empty playground. And then just think about the chasing dust devils as like the medium and the engineer, right? Sometimes a roughly car-sized dust devil would glide across the 4 square courts and between the swing sets and score a direct hit on the jungle gym, which was an old-fashioned, unpadded, child-paralyzing unit hammered together by some kind of Dark Ages ironmonger and planted in solid concrete, a real school of hard knocks, survival of the fittest one. And the dust devil would seem to pause as it enveloped the jungle gym, and it would completely lose its form and become a puff of dust that would begin to settle back down to the ground, as if all heavier-than-air things really ought to. But then, suddenly, the dust devil would reappear on the other side of the jungle gym and keep going. Or perhaps 2 dust devils would spin off in opposite directions. And I really love that image. Just thinking about that, the identity as the dust devil and hitting up against something really hard and then totally decomposing and then reorganizing in a different way. I think whether that's hitting up against something really hard within a lifetime or at the end of a lifetime and like pre-reincarnation, that's pretty interesting. Randy spent plenty of time chasing and carrying out impromptu experiments on dust devils while walking to and from school, to the point of getting bounced off the grill of a shrieking Buick once when he chased a roughly shopping cart-sized one into the street in an attempt to climb into the center of it. He knew that they were both fragile and tenacious. You could stomp down on one of them and sometimes it would just dodge your foot or swirl around it and keep moving. And other times, like if you tried to catch one in your hands, it would vanish. But then you'd look up and see another one just like it 20 feet away, running away from you. The whole concept of matter spontaneously organizing itself into grotesquely improbable and yet indisputably self-perpetuating and fairly robust systems sort of gave Randy the willies later on when he began to learn about physics. And I would say like the idea of these self-organizing systems on various scales and coming together and spinning apart and how we interpenetrate each other or cross-pollinate each other, how that works on the attention economy and even in real biological life, how our auras interpenetrate one another and the influence we have on each other is pretty interesting. There was no room for dust devils in the laws of physics, at least in the rigid form in which they were usually taught. There is a kind of unspoken collusion going on in mainstream science education. You get your competent but bored, insecure, and hence stodgy teacher talking to an audience divided between engineering students who are going to be responsible for making bridges that won't fall down, or airplanes that won't suddenly plunge vertically into the ground at 600 miles an hour, and who by definition get sweaty palms and vindictive attitudes when their teacher suddenly veers off track and begins raving about wild and completely non-intuitive phenomena. And physics students who derive much of their self-esteem from knowing that they are smarter and morally purer than the engineering students, and who by definition don't want to hear about anything that makes no fucking sense. This collusion results in the professor saying something along the lines of, dust is heavier than air, and therefore it falls until it hits the ground, and that's all there is to know about dust. The engineers love it because they like their issues dead and crucified like butterflies under glass. And the physicists love it because they want to think that they understand everything. And no one asks difficult questions. And outside the windows, the dust devils continue to gamble across the campus. So, and the thing about Randy Waterhouse in Cryptonomicon, he's the 20th century counterpart, is that they're in the Philippines setting up a giant underground data center to run a crypto economy, and this is 1999. And so if we think about, again, our identities and our digital identities as dust devil graphs spinning in the limbo of some sort of interdimensional space and tracking that, and that each dust devil is unique, right? And that the speed and the size would have its own frequency. You know, there's just a really core part of me that thinks that this next phase that we're entering into of life on this planet is about systems organizing themselves into more complex harmonics to, again, engage with these higher dimensional fields. And ultimately, I think that some of this could easily intersect with some of the like disclosure or other life forms or hybrid life forms, because I think we think of them like hybrid life forms as being representing in a certain material physical way. But from an information physics standpoint, like there could be whole cosmoses where the tetrahedra are just spinning on a slightly different angle, and they're not some giant far distance. They're just like right here. It's at an angle that's separate from the angle that we're seeing everything at. And, you know, it seems logical that there might be intelligences that have figured this out and are looking down at us trying to like give us a hand up to join the party from a loving way. And that's the story that I like to lean into right now. So, yeah, so there's my story of my Triceratops beetle and my Trombocino squashes, and I think I'm gonna go try to make a berry tart. It's probably not advisable to heat up my oven at mid-afternoon. This is the hottest time of the day, but it's only 25 minutes, so I think that's doable. And, you know, thanks for playing along. And like I said, we're in the middle of this sort of eclipse season, and I'm pulling again, like weaving a lot of these different ideas, but I'm excited actually. I've gotten to the point that I'm excited about the possibilities, and I'm excited about the idea that we can be in communication if we're coming from a coherent place of the heart. And there's some element that I'm kind of grateful for. This is social media, right? Like, although at this point there are very few comments that are on these videos, but I'm not in the maelstrom of trying to navigate all of this information. The information I have is mostly, at this stage, I've got paper books and I'm reading them, and I'm thinking about things really just based on my own world model. And I'm not saying that the world model that I'm coming up with is somehow superior to other people's models. It's just a model that makes sense to me, and it gives me a story that I find satisfying and exciting. And yeah, so for all of those episodes that made it clear that I shouldn't be on, I dabbled very briefly last month with like making a Substack account to comment on something, and it was a bad idea because I'm not built for that. So I'm just doing the thing that I'm built for, which is gardening and looking to the natural world and immersing myself in this particular landscape and synthesizing some of my quirky life experiences into something that I think applies to information theory and complex math and networks and ritual and culture because I can and it's fun. All right, I hope you're all well. Stay cool if you're under the heat dome like me. All right, bye-bye.